Okay, so you guys have really given us a lot to think about this time.
Yeah.
This whole set of articles and reports you sent about Trump's tariff policies and protectionism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big one. And you're really interested in this question of how reliable is the U.S. going to be as a business partner?
Right.
If this keeps going, and is it even possible to bring manufacturing back to the U.S.
Exactly.
with this kind of approach?
So that's what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
Really trying to understand what these sources are saying.
Yeah.
Articles about economics, trade, and even some surveys about how businesses are feeling about all this. What are the core arguments here? And what might actually happen to companies in global trade, if this plays out?
Yeah. You know what really jumps out at me from these articles?
Yeah.
Is this tension that you picked up on.
Right.
There's this strong desire, and I get it, to see American businesses doing well.
Of course.
Have jobs here in the U.S. But the big question these sources raise is whether this path, using tariffs so aggressively, is it really the best way to do that?
Right. Or could it even end up having the opposite effect?
Yeah.
We have to look beyond the goals, the stated goals, and really try to figure out what's likely to happen.
Exactly. So let's sort of lay the groundwork here.
Okay.
What does Trump's protectionist strategy actually look like?
Yeah.
Based on what these articles are telling us. The main idea seems pretty straightforward, right? You put big taxes on imports.
Yep.
And that makes things made overseas more expensive.
Right.
So American-made products start to look more appealing to shoppers and companies.
It makes sense.
And theoretically, that should encourage businesses to move their manufacturing back to the U.S. Reshoring is what they call it.
That's the idea.
Right.
The basic mechanism. Yeah. And the sources point out that we saw this happening during his first term with that 25% tariff on steel and the 10% on aluminum.
Right.
And from what's being talked about now, it seems like there could be even bigger tariffs coming.
Wow.
We're seeing proposals for up to 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. And then a 10 to 20% tariff on pretty much everything imported from almost every country.
Wow.
There were even posts on X back in March of 2025.
Oh, wow.
Talking about a possible 25% tariff on cars. And get this, a 200% tariff on European wines.
200% on wine.
These aren't just little tweaks, This would be a massive change in trade policy.
Oh, absolutely. A 200% tariff on European wines.
Right.
Just think what that would do to that industry.
Yeah.
Not to mention the chance that other countries would retaliate with their own tariffs.
Exactly.
But, the driving force behind all this, like your sources make clear, is the Make America Great Again agenda.
Yeah.
It's all tied into this idea of bringing back American manufacturing, creating more jobs here.
Yeah.
And being less reliant on global supply chains.
Right. And that's a message that a lot of people find appealing.
Of course.
The idea of America being self-sufficient and having a strong manufacturing base.
Yeah.
It's a powerful idea. But this brings us to a really important concern that your sources highlight, which is the potential damage to the United States' reputation as a reliable partner in trade.
Interesting.
When you think about what makes international commerce work smoothly,
Yeah.
predictability is key. Businesses need a stable and dependable environment so they can plan for the future.
Right.
So they can make investments with confidence.
Absolutely. Yeah. And these tariffs, right?
Yes.
Being so aggressive and unpredictable,
Exactly.
that's where the problems could start, right?
That's the worry. Businesses all over the world, they're all part of these complex global supply chains.
Yeah.
They need to know that the rules of the game aren't going to suddenly change because of some huge new tariff or the threat of sanctions.
Of course.
That kind of uncertainty makes the U.S. look like a risky place to do business.
Yeah. You mentioned in your email that you were especially interested in how these policies might affect the U.S.'s reliability as a partner. So let's really dig into what the sources say about that.
Okay, so what the sources are suggesting is that if the U.S. keeps getting seen as unreliable for trade, if it keeps suddenly imposing tariffs or changing trade deals, businesses are going to start looking for other options, places that are more stable.
Right.
And this isn't just some theory. We're seeing data that shows this China plus one strategy becoming more common.
Oh, interesting.
Companies are making sure they have production capacity outside of China to reduce risk.
Okay.
And these unpredictable tariff policies in the U.S. are making them think twice about where that plus one location should be.
I see.
We're talking about a potential shift in supply chains and investment, moving away from the U.S. and towards places like Southeast Asia or even the EU.
Wow.
where the future of trade seems more dependable.
So it's like companies are hedging their bets.
Yeah, exactly. They're looking for safer ground.
And we have actual examples of this happening.
We do?
The sources talk about the trade disputes back in 2018 and 2019 when the U.S. put tariffs in place. China retaliated with tariffs of their own.
Right.
On American agricultural products like soybeans.
Yeah.
Which really hurt American farmers financially.
It did. And the EU did the same thing, putting tariffs on iconic American products like bourbon and Harley-Davidson motorcycles.
Wow. It wasn't just the U.S. imposing tariffs.
Right.
Other countries hit back.
Exactly. And those are really important examples because they show that protectionism isn't something you do in isolation. There's almost always a response from the countries that are affected.
Right.
And that can cause real economic damage to the country that started it all.
It's like a trade war.
Yeah, in a way. And it's not just about the past either.
Okay.
This survey by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the CFIB, it gives us a really clear picture of what's happening right now. It found that almost half, 47% of Canadian small and medium-sized businesses no longer see the U.S. as a reliable trade partner.
Real?
Specifically because of the disruptions caused by tariffs.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Almost half of Canadian SMEs?
Yeah, and think about it. These are businesses that have really integrated supply chains with the U.S.
Right.
For them to be questioning our reliability, that's a big deal.
It is. It's not just about trade disagreements.
Right.
It suggests a loss of trust that could have lasting effects on the North American economy.
Exactly. It's a fundamental shift.
That 47% figure is really worrying.
It is.
It shows the real impact of these policies.
Right.
It's not just theoretical.
And as that CFIB survey shows, it's not just about negative feelings either. It's leading to concrete actions.
What do you mean?
Canadian businesses are actively trying to diversify their supply chains and move their investments away from the U.S. They're looking to their own domestic market or to other countries.
So they're basically trying to reduce their exposure to the U.S.
Exactly. They're minimizing risk.
This brings us to a really important question about the whole idea of bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.
Industrial repatriation.
Right. Bringing those jobs back. It sounds simple and appealing, but these sources that you sent, they really get into some of the contradictions in trying to do this mainly through tariffs.
Yeah, there are some real challenges there.
They point out that modern manufacturing is not just happening in one factory or even one country anymore.
Right.
It's all part of these complex and specialized global supply chains.
Exactly. It's a global web.
So even if a company decides to move a factory back to the U.S., it's still probably going to need parts and materials from overseas.
Most likely.
The sources give examples like advanced semiconductors from Asia or rare earth metals from South America.
Yeah. You can't just recreate entire industries overnight.
Right. And if those essential imports get hit with tariffs, then what?
That's the problem. And that's where tariffs can actually work against the whole idea of reshoring.
How so?
Because they make those imported parts and materials more expensive, which means higher production costs for American manufacturers. So even if they're making the final product in the U.S., their costs are higher because of those tariffs.
So they're less competitive.
Exactly. They're at a disadvantage compared to companies in countries with lower costs and more open trade.
It's almost like shooting yourself in the foot.
In a way, yeah. Think about it like a smartphone.
Okay.
The screen might be made in South Korea, the processor in Taiwan, the battery in China, and then it's all assembled in Vietnam. Tariffs on any of those parts can have a ripple effect through the whole process, ultimately making the final product more expensive, even if it's assembled in the U.S.
We even have a real-world example of this.
We do.
General Motors criticized the steel tariffs back in 2018, saying they were hurting their profits.
Exactly.
So the very thing that's supposed to be protecting American industry can actually end up hurting it by making things more expensive.
It's a counterintuitive outcome.
And the sources also make this point, that just putting tariffs in place doesn't automatically mean companies are going to come back to the U.S.
It's not a magic bullet.
You need a lot more than that. To make the U.S. attractive for manufacturing, you need investment.
Absolutely.
On things like infrastructure, upgrading our transportation systems, energy grids, all of that. Workforce training to make sure we have skilled workers. And tax incentives to make it financially worthwhile for companies to relocate here.
All those things matter.
Tariffs on their own don't address any of that.
They're just one piece of the puzzle.
It's like trying to get someone to move into a house just by building a wall around the neighborhood.
Yeah, good analogy.
You have to make the house itself attractive and livable.
Exactly. You need the whole package.
And without that broader strategy,
Right.
the sources suggest that companies might just decide to stay overseas.
It's a real possibility.
Or even move to countries that are more stable,
Yeah.
more business-friendly overall.
Uh-huh.
They might just bypass the U.S. market altogether,
Makes sense.
rather than deal with the complications and extra costs of tariffs.
It's a business decision at the end of the day.
Right. Now, one argument that we hear a lot in favor of tariffs is that they can be used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations.
Yeah. The leverage argument.
Right.
Yeah.
The idea is that by imposing tariffs,
Yeah.
you can pressure other countries to make concessions
He gave you what you want.
on trade issues.
Yeah.
And the sources do mention this.
They do.
Some of them point to the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, as a possible example where the threat of tariffs might have helped get a new trade deal.
It's possible that it played a role.
So the idea is you use the pressure of tariffs,
Yeah.
whether you actually impose them or just threaten to
Right.
bring other countries to the table
Fair shake.
and hopefully get a better deal for your own country.
It's a high-stakes strategy.
It is. But the sources also warn against relying too much on this approach,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with big players like China
Uh-huh.
or the European Union.
Right.
They say it could backfire,
It could.
leading to more tension and isolation.
Instead of getting those concessions.
Instead of getting what you want.
Exactly. You could end up alienating important trading partners
Right.
and damaging relationships that are crucial for diplomacy and the economy.
So it's a risky game to play.
It can be.
And it seems like the overall view in these sources
Yeah.
is that this strategy of using tariffs aggressively as a main negotiating tactic,
Yeah.
it comes with a lot of risks and downsides for international relations.
That's the takeaway.
Now, if we look further ahead,
Okay.
the articles do briefly touch on some other possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
What if these tariffs were kept in place for a long time?
Yeah.
Could global supply chains eventually adapt completely?
That's the question.
And could we actually see a lot of reshoring happen,
Right?
despite all the economic disruption at the beginning?
It's a possibility that the sources acknowledge.
Okay.
The idea is that if tariffs become a permanent fixture, part of the landscape,
Right.
businesses might eventually make those big investments to move their production back and rebuild those domestic supply chains.
It's like a long-term adjustment.
Yeah, but there's a big if here.
What's that?
It would require a lot of time, huge amounts of investment,
Right.
and maybe, most importantly, a long period of political stability.
And consistent trade policies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as the sources point out, those conditions are far from guaranteed.
Especially with the potential for policy changes
Right.
and new presidents coming in.
It's a very uncertain future.
So it's a big if with a lot of things that have to fall into place.
A lot of ifs.
And even if this long-term adaptation did happen, the sources seem to be saying that the economic pain in the short term
Yeah,
could be pretty bad and pretty widespread.
there would be a lot of adjustment pain.
So as we wrap up this discussion,
Okay.
what would you say is the main message from these sources about this goal of bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.?
I think the main takeaway from these sources is that while the goal of strengthening American industries and creating jobs here, it's a good goal and a lot of people support it.
Right.
Relying mainly on these aggressive tariffs is the way to do it.
Yeah.
It comes with a lot of risks.
Okay.
And those risks are complex. They have many sides to them.
So it's not a simple solution.
It's not just about putting up trade barriers.
Right.
It's about actively creating an environment where businesses want to come back.
And where they can succeed in the long run.
Exactly.
And the sources, they all seem to agree on this.
Yeah.
We need a broader, more strategic approach.
A more holistic one.
What would that look like?
It would probably involve a mix of things.
Okay.
Positive incentives like strategic investments in infrastructure, good workforce development programs, and targeted tax breaks.
Okay.
But it also means working with other countries.
To make sure global supply chains are stable.
Right.
And to maintain access to international markets.
Exactly. Relying on tariffs alone, you risk undermining all of that.
So it's not just about protectionism.
It's about finding a balance.
Right. Okay, so we've really dug into the potential downsides here.
You have.
The risk to the U.S.'s reputation as a reliable trade partner. The contradictions in trying to bring manufacturing back, just with tariffs.
Right.
And the problems with using tariffs as the main way to negotiate trade deals.
Yeah.
It seems like these sources are saying that this approach,
Yeah.
while it has a clear goal,
Yeah.
it might actually end up doing more harm than good.
That's the concern.
It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah. Sometimes the things we do to try to help
Uh-huh.
end up having unintended consequences.
Exactly. And the global economy is so interconnected these days.
It is.
What one country does can have a big impact on others.
Absolutely.
And those consequences can come back around and hurt the country that started it all.
It's a complex web of cause and effect.
It is. This has been a really fascinating deep dive
It has.
into a really important issue.
A crucial one.
It seems like the key tension here
Uh-huh.
is this balance between wanting to protect American industries
Right.
and encourage them to come back home,
Yeah.
but then also the risks of using tariffs aggressively
Uh-huh.
and having a purely protectionist approach.
A very America-first approach.
Yeah.
Huh.
We're talking about the very real possibility
Uh-huh.
that the U.S. could start to be seen as unreliable
Less predictable.
in the global business world,
Yeah.
which could mean higher costs for companies and consumers,
Right.
retaliation from other countries that hurts American businesses,
Exactly.
and instability in those complex global supply chains.
The ones that our modern economy depends on.
And the irony is that these policies,
Mm-hmm.
they might actually make it harder to bring manufacturing back to the U.S.
Yeah.
by raising costs for American companies and alienating our trading partners.
It's a paradoxical outcome.
It is.
Yeah.
So these sources, they really make us think beyond the immediate appeal of protectionism.
They challenge us
They do. They make us consider the bigger picture
to think about the long game.
of international trade and all the potential unintended consequences.
Exactly. To look beyond the surface.
So as we finish up, here's a final thought for you all to consider.
Okay.
In this interconnected global economy, can any country really achieve lasting economic security and prosperity by going it alone?
By isolating itself.
Right. Without the risk of actually harming the very industries it's trying to protect.
That's the question.
What's the right balance
Yeah.
between strategic protectionism,
Uh-huh.
where you're smart about protecting certain industries
Right.
and being actively engaged with the rest of the world
Working with other countries.
to build a healthy and thriving global economy?
That's the challenge.
There are no easy answers.
No.
But this question is at the heart of all these debates
It is.
about economic policy.
It's something we have to keep grappling with.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Always a pleasure.